Tell Us About Yourself is sponsored by bonusround.ca, streaming Canada's classic game shows on demand. Dive into the golden age of television with thousands of episodes of Canadian series that defined an era from anywhere in the world, all for just $1.99 a month. From iconic shows like Let's Make a Deal and Definition to cult classics like Bumper Stumpers and The Mad Dash, bonusround.ca brings you timeless entertainment that's fun, enlightening, and affordable. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, relive the magic of Canadian television history. Subscribe now at bonusround.ca for $1.99 and turn every night into Game Show Night. By Game Show Forensics. Join host Robert McKee and his crack team of forensic game show scientists as they take you on the deepest dives imaginable in a quest to analyze the most detailed minutia of game shows nobody else dares to, or cares to, investigate. Nothing is too whimsical for examination, no semantics too absurd for the research extremists at GameShowForensics.com. Parental discretion is advised. And by The Inn at Leola Village. Nestled in the heart of picturesque Pennsylvania, the Inn at Leola Village is a sanctuary of luxury and relaxation. Indulge in the timeless beauty of their historic suites, each meticulously designed to transport you to a bygone era of elegance and grace. Experience the culinary delights of their award-winning Italian restaurant, where every dish is a masterpiece crafted from the finest local ingredients. From romantic getaways to corporate retreats, the Inn at Leola Village offers a haven for every occasion. Unwind at the spa, stroll through the lush gardens, and let the stress of everyday life melt away. Make your reservation today at theinnatleolavillage.com or call the front desk at area code 717-656-7002. The Inn at Leola Village, an oasis of luxury. Tell Us About Yourself. Conversations with Game Show Contestants is produced in partnership with the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, one of the largest history museums in the United States, and one of the leading museums serving families with highly interactive exhibits and programs. Since 1968, the Strong Museum has been dedicated to exploring the ways in which play encourages learning, creativity, and discovery, and how it illuminates cultural history. And their National Archives of Game Show History. Founded by industry veterans Bob Bowden and Howard Blumenthal, the archive is home to thousands of artifacts representing over 80 years of broadcasting, including props, set designs, video interviews with game show professionals, and other iconic elements from the history of television at play. For more information about the National Archives of Game Show History or the Strong National Museum of Play, visit museumofplay.org or call area code 585-263-2700.
Blue 35.
Tell us about yourself, would you?
Tell us something about you.
For any new viewers, why don't you tell us again about yourself?
We've met before, but let's meet again. Tell us about yourself.
What else can you tell us about yourself?
Perhaps you'd fill us in again and tell us about yourself.
Here to introduce the challenger, Summer Bartholomew. Yeah, Jan survived a tiebreaker on the last show. Survive is what it comes down to with a tiebreaker.
Really?
Who do you have?
This man has an historical outlook from East Lansing, Michigan. Give a hearty hello to Matt Ottinger.
Hi there, Matt. And Matt, you had have a historical outlook.
Jim, one of my favorite hobbies is researching the history of television, something I've had a great deal of chance to do here in California for the past few weeks.
Right. So what are you going to do with that?
I'd like to write a book eventually.
So, sounds good. Well, you've got good ambitions there. I'm glad both of you could join us. And let's get you started. $20 starts all three players. Player with the most money at the end of the show is a champion. Gets to do some great shopping. Good luck as we get started with this.
My name is Matt Ottinger. I live in Dimondale, Michigan, work in a small town called Okemos, Michigan, where I am, at least for the next few months, the telecommunications director for the Okemos public school system. I'll be retiring at the end of this school year. I was on Sale of the Century in the 80s. I was on Jeopardy in 2004, and I was in the waiting room supposed to be on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and didn't get the opportunity.
Matt, why didn't we see more game show hosts like Bill Cullen as guests on talk shows back in the day? I would think that hosts of that era, because they were so gregarious and talkative and funny and witty and well-liked, that you would see them in other venues. But that never really happened. I think of things like The Tonight Show. Why weren't game show hosts guests on talk shows like that so often back then?
What happened in the period that I think of, the television I grew up with, which would have been the 60s and the 70s, I think there was a distinct segregation that game show hosts were game show hosts, and that's what they did. And nowadays, of course, you've got stand-up comics, you've got actors, you've got all sorts of people hosting game shows and interacting and going on the talk shows to talk about their game show. You're right, we didn't have that back in the day. Bill Cullen himself was, of course, more of a broadcaster than he was necessarily just a game show host. But he's gone on record. We have quotes from him about how he did not like the experience, at least of hosting something like The Tonight Show, which they had to do a couple of times. So it depends on the person, I think. Certainly, if you had a comic background like Richard Dawson did, Richard Dawson did make appearances on talk shows. But you're right, the hosts themselves really didn't get that chance. I think one of the things, and I said about the segregation, in Britain, it's a lot looser. You have the term presenter. And that means a game show host, that means a talk show host, that means a newscaster. It means anybody who's themselves on camera. And that's all one big group of people. We didn't have that in this country.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that era where game shows were very... I've seen old reviews of game shows from the 60s and 70s, and they use a lot of terms like, the downfall of civilization. And
yes.
You know what I mean? Just how this was the beginning of the end, apparently, for TV, that game shows were just so, quote unquote, disposable and light and not serious, not worthy of serious thought or study.
And they've always been a little like that. But it's interesting, too. We're talking about that period in the 60s and 70s. If you go to the beginning of television, it wasn't like that. I mean, John Daly was a newsman who moonlighted on Sunday nights to host What's My Line. Gary Moore hosted I've Got a Secret, while some of that run he was hosting a daily variety show in the daytime. And then for some of that run, a wildly popular primetime variety show. And then once a week, he'd do the game show. So back in the 50s, maybe, it wasn't so unusual for them to be major figures. Bill Cullen himself was on the cover of TV Guide half a dozen times. So originally, it wasn't such a thing. And then in the 60s and into the 70s and certainly way into the 80s, where game shows fell out of favor altogether, game shows were not a thing. And nowadays, they're back in prime time. They're on routinely, but I don't think anybody really, except us fans, like you and me and so many of our friends, take them real seriously. They are still considered somewhat disposable.
And I think that is part of why there is this, I think, a need for something like this National Archives of Game Show History that we're doing this podcast for, It is, no matter how hard people like you and I, and again, like you said, our friends try, game shows will always have that pocket of critics who, don't see the long-term value or don't see value, period, in that kind of entertainment. Not to be such a shameless self-promoter, but I am glad that the museum will exist to be some sort of testament to the seriousness of that kind of television.
Yeah, I'm very excited with what the Strong Museum is doing, with your work with the podcast, with what Bob Bowden is doing, with what Adam Nedeff is doing, and other people that we know and some people we don't know who are contributing. As you probably know, and some of your listeners will know, I have a pretty massive collection of the home games of various game shows, and I'm going to be soon donating a lot of that to the Strong Museum. So that's my little part of keeping that place filled with all of this terrific history.
How wonderful. Matt, did I know that before you said it just now?
I don't know. I hadn't. I guess I have to do it now because I made it public, didn't I? People listen to this, don't they?
I hope so. On paper they do.
I've had a couple of meetings with their archivist, and we have talked about donating my game collection. Not necessarily all of it. It's a little complicated because they've already gotten some donations, and they don't want to necessarily have duplicates of things. So we're working through what the process will be. It just happens that we're working through it right as I'm having this interview with you, so it's fresh in my head. But yeah, I'm getting to the point now where I need to sort of consolidate what I own, and one of the things I wanted to do is, well, what can I do with these 500-600 games that I have? And then the Strong Museum presented this opportunity, so I wanted to be a part of that.
With a number like 600, how do you determine if you were to cut that collection down, if you had to save space or otherwise, put games elsewhere? How do you determine what you keep and what you don't keep? Is it playability? Is it sentimental value? Is it rarity?
Boy, those are three interesting things. It's definitely not playability. I rarely play my games. I don't happen to have a lot of people locally that would enjoy that. So my games are more, it was a fun thing to acquire them. It was they're really more sort of, if you will, museum pieces. But certainly rarity. It's interesting. I moved about 7 or 8 years ago from one house to a smaller house. And in that move, I left some games behind. And I think it was the lack of interest that I had in the game personally. A lot of the children's games, for example, didn't make that cut. And now I'm left with the question of, when I donate to the Strong, what do I keep? What is important to me to have? And it's a tough decision because I don't want it to be a large number, which makes it all the harder to decide what makes that cut and what doesn't. Value is not relevant to me. It doesn't matter to me what the games might fetch on eBay or anything like that. There is sentimental value to some of them. My copy of Merv Griffin's Word for Word was given to me by a cousin that I treat like a sister, with a note in it because it had been her family's game. So that's not leaving my possession.
Sure.
Some have sentimental value to me too. It's going to be an interesting decision I'll have to make.
A fun decision, I bet.
Fun
because
decision.
It's
Absolutely.
always part of why I love collecting the games that I do, and I don't have 600, but one day maybe I'll get there. I have quite a few. One of the reasons why I love having the game, this is not only to play them, but it's to look at them. I love looking at them. I love having them on display. I think the art on these boxes is beautiful and reminds me of an art form that means a lot to me. So it's great to, it's the equivalent of a poet having, shelves lined with books.
And it's fun, because we know each other through the internet. That I actually decorate my room with boxes of game show home games that I will change up every once in a while based on whatever whim and theme suits my fancy. It might be boxes of games that Bill Cullen hosted, or it might be boxes of games that predate television and are part of the old-time radio scene. And those are ones I'm particularly fond of, even though generally they're not as interesting to other people. But games that all debuted in the same year, or whatever my whim is, I've got a place on my wall where I'll put some of those games. So yeah, I do decorate with my home games.
I am very familiar with it because, Matt, everyone thinks I'm just some big smart guy and that I know everything about game shows. I want to tell you, of the photos that you've posted of the various collections you put on the wall with like a common theme, I have only solved one of them. I have only solved one, and it's a great brain teaser for people like us, because I know the names of the shows. I know. Sure. I know what each of them are, and just try to figure out what connects all of them. It's a really fun little diversion. I enjoy seeing it on my feed.
Well, the games that are interesting to me are older than probably the games that are more interesting to you. So that probably does make it a little bit harder for you to necessarily discern some of my madness.
You're probably right. What era in your mind produced the best game show home games? Because I think that there's a difference between what era had the greatest game shows and what era had the greatest merchandise related to those game shows. I wonder where that intersection is.
That's a really good question, and I think it's tough to answer that because of the fatal flaw of any of us game show fans. We are fixated, any of us, on the games that we grew up with. So my first thought when you said that would be that the golden era of home games would be the ones from the 60s. And in defense of that claim, that's when Milton Bradley was putting out Concentration every year, and Password every year, and Jeopardy every year. And those games had a staying power that no game before had. Maybe you'd get a second edition or maybe a third edition from some of the old games of the 50s. But Milton Bradley, especially with Password, created a fan base, an eagerness to grab the new version when it came out. And so for me, that is a really interesting piece. Now, a lot of people then who are younger than me will look to the advent of computer games and say, well, when the computer games hit and you could play a much more realistic experience at home, even the original computer games, which of course were not realistic remotely, it was still a closer experience to what you saw on television than the cardboard box. So I'm sure there would be a lot of people who would say that would be the greatest period. The original part of the games coming out in the 50s, you talk about wanting to see the boxes, the art of the boxes. Those 50s games tended to be much larger and much more vibrantly colorful art. And so there's an appeal there. So my answer is the 60s, but I think that's partly because that's what I grew up with.
I think I might agree with you, though, because the 60s, you had this era of plastic. All these games had their own custom-made plastic parts, and I think of I Guess with the big clunky sort of flaps that would reveal the answers. I think of the concentration board and the way the puzzles were turned, the roll-o-matic puzzle. To me, that's just the perfect aesthetic for a game show whole game. I think of that colorful plastic, and I think of just a tactile experience of those materials. And then you get into the 70s where it seems like a lot of games, and you might have more insight into this than I do because you have so many more than I do, but it seems like a lot of that type of game tended to be a big box of paper. It was, the game approximated on the cheapest material they could find. And so it might as well have been a book and not a home game.
There was definitely cost cutting that happened through the development of the home game. Go back to the originals, and there was a game that had a full xylophone inside it. The 50s games, the clunky device that you played tic-tac-toe with was a great big plastic thing. Milton Bradley made them smaller in the 60s, but they still, like you said, were attractive and solid and had the plastic pieces. And then you're right, as it got on, the 70s, the 80s, before long, you've got decent sized boxes that have practically nothing inside them.
Matt, tell me where your love of game shows, your long storied love of game shows began. What got you into this type of TV? What kept you hooked, and what made you eventually want to become somebody who, in his own way, worked in that sphere?
That's true. I did. I was very fortunate in that respect. Well, it was from the beginning. I mean, from the absolute beginning. I was of the generation that grew up with television as the babysitter. Parents would just put the child in front of the television, and that was the entertainment, and I was hooked. I was a perfectly happy child to be watching television. My game was concentration. I can remember pretty clearly from a pretty young age being fascinated by concentration, probably the game board and the clunky noise that the cylinders would make when they would turn around. And of course, at a young age, I couldn't possibly have solved the rebuses, but concentration, after all, at its base is a children's game. What's under this one? What's under this one? Where's the match? What's under this one? What's under this one? Where's the match? That's something that children, it has always been a children's game. So in that respect, that was the game that got me hooked. But back then you had Password, and you had Hollywood Squares, and you had the original Jeopardy with Art Fleming, and you had games. It's so hard for really young people. I mean, I know you know this, but in the 60s and 70s, there were games in the daytime from roughly 10 o'clock in the morning till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There were games all day long. Some were great, some weren't so great, some would come and go quickly, some would stay forever. But it was always fascinating to me to watch that panorama develop. To me, a soap opera was just something that was in the way of what could have been another game show. And when I was home for the summer, or when I was home because I was sick from school, or when we had vacation days from school, or whatever it would be, I would be watching those game shows. And I knew what was on. I couldn't necessarily duplicate this now, but I knew what was on what channel and when I needed to change the channel from that channel to this channel, because that game show wasn't as good as this game show, or that was going to be a soap opera. We don't watch the soap operas. We got to switch over to that channel. And I would watch game shows even when the choices were not my favorites. I would watch a game show over anything else.
I'm the same way. My TV was just the machine that game shows came out of. And
yes, exactly.
But that's all it was. And maybe I'm biased, but to me, game shows are the perfect form of entertainment to put on television. It's what TV should be. It's mentally stimulating. It's exciting. It's fun. It's positive. It's colorful. So I feel like I agree. Anything that wasn't a game show, so why is this on? There could be something else here.
It's also, game shows are so easy to engage with. Take soap operas, for example. If you were to suddenly start watching, I don't even know which ones are on anymore. Days of Our Lives, I know that one's still on. If you were suddenly watching Days of Our Lives and hadn't watched it before, well, you wouldn't know what's going on. But if you watch Wheel of Fortune for the very first time, you pick it up in about a minute. Oh, okay, that they're playing Hangman. Or if you watch Jeopardy, well, they're responding to the clues that they see on the screen. A good game show can pull you in a hurry in a way that other formats really struggle with. I mean, any kind of scripted drama has to set up the situation that you have to embrace and that takes time. A game show doesn't have to do that. Once you understand the basics of the rules, certainly some games are more complicated than others, but once you understand the basics of the rules, you're right there and you're engaged and you're yelling things at the TV, and that's just the best kind of engagement.
That's right. Yeah, whether it's the first episode or the 100th episode, you could just jump right in and follow along.
Yeah.
I had that experience in college. I tried to watch Doctor Who once, and I really couldn't get into it, and I referred to it later as was like going to a party that's been happening for 30 years and you just got invited last weekend, so there are all these in jokes that you don't know and everybody's already bonded and it's hard to break through.
That's a really good analogy. And then compare that to Wheel of Fortune, which has been on a lot more than 30 years. If for some reason you had never seen, I can't imagine somebody had never seen Wheel of Fortune before, you're not confused. You understand the basics of what's going on.
Oh, yeah. And talk about a format that just naturally pulls you in.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me about the first time your love of this type of television and the actual working world of broadcasting intersected. How did that come about for you?
That's a very interesting story to me, but I don't know how well I'll be able to express it, so it's an interesting story to your listeners. Let's try.
I'm sure they're going to love it.
Well, in college, I got to experience something that is no longer really a thing, and that's something called public access television.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Michigan State University, and the East Lansing Cable Company, where MSU was located, had an extremely active public access studio. I was getting my experience, I've always wanted to do this, so I was a telecommunications major, and I was getting studio experience in my classes. But at this studio, just down the street from campus, you could go in and you could make any show you wanted. You could be the producer, you could be the star, you could be the host, you could do whatever you want. And I loved that. And the very first thing that I did there is I created a television show that was a game show. We called it Trivia Run, Trivia R-U-N, Trivia Run. And it was a College Bowl-like thing with 3 people on one team and 3 people on the other team. But it was mostly pop culture stuff as opposed to an academic quiz. I wrote the material myself. I did it all myself. And of course, I hosted it myself. And we did that for a couple of years. And that was my first taste of taking my love of game shows and putting it essentially on the air. Now, I wasn't getting paid for this, but it did get me noticed in the area, which led to some professional opportunities and eventually the show that locally I've become somewhat known for.
I talked about it a couple times, but I credit any success I've ever had in this thing that we're doing to having an early exposure to public access TV. The public access in New Haven, Connecticut. My dad and I took the class together and became, certified producers. And you're right. Sure. It's just like if you love TV and want to get experience, it's like a wonderland. You could hit all the buttons.
It's like there was a gate, but the gate wasn't locked. You could get in and you could do it. Anymore, there's not even a gate, and I think that dilutes it. Nowadays, you've got a studio on your cell phone, and you've got exposure through TikTok and YouTube and Instagram and all the social medias. There's no, anybody who happens to get a little bit of luck can go viral, and suddenly you're a national figure without any kind of having to be at a studio or be hired by a producer or any of that stuff. So for those of us who had the opportunity to do public access, it was the most minimal gatekeeping there was at the time, as opposed to there being zero now. So people who didn't know that experience don't know how much fun that was to basically do your own thing within the general structure of professional broadcast television.
Matt, Sale of the Century is one of my favorite shows ever. And when I visited the Strong Museum for my birthday this past year, I got a tour of the storage facility. And among the props that were getting ready to be refurbished was the original desk where the contestants sat from Sale of the Century, and I remember just how surreal it was to see that in person. You saw it back in the mid 80s. How did that opportunity to become a contestant on Sale of the Century come about for you?
I'll tell you that story, but first I want to tell you something else. I have sat behind that desk on 2 different occasions, decades apart, because as we know, Bob Bowden, the phenomenal producer and friend of the format for years and years and years and years, owned that desk.
Right.
And visiting him long after Sale of the Century had been a distant memory of mine, he had the desk, and I got to sit behind the desk a second time. Of course, it wasn't wired to anything, but it was a talk about surreal experience.
How incredible.
I had been there. I knew I had done this, and here it is in a friend's backyard. It was very surreal.
That is incredibly surreal.
Isn't that wacky?
And it's incredible.
And I'll probably get a third chance when I finally get up to Strong myself.
For sure,
I'll probably get a third chance.
And it's okay if you don't remember, but that second time you sat at the desk with Bob, what memories come back? Does it do anything to jog those memories?
Absolutely. I mean, honestly, this would have been probably about 20 years after I had been on the show. Maybe a little less, but roughly 20 years after I had been on the show. And unlike Jeopardy, and I know we're going to get to talking about Jeopardy, Sale of the Century generally has faded out of the public consciousness. It's not there in your face all the time. So therefore, it's not something that I'm reminded of routinely. I mean, I know logically in my head I was on the show, but to see part of the actual set, and no, it wasn't a recreation, it's actually that set piece, really did bring back an awful lot of memories from that experience, which was my first experience in California, much less my first experience on a game show. So let me tell you that story.
Yeah, please.
I had a friend here, the fellow who runs the Pinball Hall of Fame today in Las Vegas. He and I were buddies at one point. We're out of touch now. And he wanted to go to California. And I said, I want to go to California. I want to see if I can be on a game show. And this is 1985. And we just decided to go to California. And I didn't have any idea what you did to get on a game show, except one thing. And it's one of those weird things that just talks about how old this experience is. The want ads of the newspaper. The Los Angeles Times would have want ads in the back, and they would be looking for contestants for this game show or that. And remember, as I said, back then, game shows were heavy. There were a lot of game shows, and they needed people.
A lot of pilots as well, run-throughs and pilots and demos and all that. Yeah.
That reminds me of another. I'm gonna remember another story to tell you. But Jeopardy was not taping at that time. The syndicated version with Alex Trebek had started by then, but they weren't looking for people. Sale of the Century was. And Christian, as you know, and as fans of the genre know, Sale of the Century is a very good, challenging quiz game.
Oh, yeah.
The trappings of it make it look a little silly. Oh, you'll buy this refrigerator for $10. But the underlying game and the strategies of the game and the gameplay where you're anticipating a question that's being read to you and you can buzz in when you think you know what the question is going to be and therefore can answer it is a whole different kind of strategy than what Jeopardy has. So I knew, yeah, this is a game I'd really want to do. There was a want ad, answered the want ad, went to the offices of Reg Grundy, took the test. This is all happening very, very quickly. Took the test, passed the test, had a great time in the room working with another group of would-be contestants, most of whom were actors, but of course you couldn't call yourself an actor. That was always the thing.
Sure.
You were from wherever you were originally from, and you weren't an actor, you were a waiter, or you were a whatever job you were doing to pull down money while trying to be an actor. But it was always actors who wanted to be game show contestants, and me. And I was there to play the game, and I think that came through. So I was very quickly picked for the syndicated version. At the time, there was the network version and the syndicated version, both being produced at the same time. For whatever reason, they wanted, they had me in the pile that went to the syndicated version. And they were going to tape in just a couple of days. This was going to be great. So a couple of days later, I go to the studio. It was in NBC. I want to say Studio 4. Somebody will know that for sure, whether I'm right or not. But it was definitely the Burbank NBC studios where they recorded.
Right.
And I got there, and it was all very exciting. I'd never seen a real, at that scale, a real television studio before. And I was in the pool, and we played the games and played the games and played the games. We were shooting 5 that day, and I never got picked. And that was disappointing. But they told me that they're going to do another one in 2 weeks. And if I can come back out, they'll guarantee me that I'll play at the next taping session. So I did. I said, well, no, this is too good an opportunity to pass up. Sure. I'm going to fly back out and be on this show. And I got that chance. I want to say it was probably in the winter or maybe early spring of 1985.
Okay, that you taped it.
That we taped the show.
Right. And actually, we should pause for a second, because in case anyone is unfamiliar with Sale of the Century, we should probably explain just really quickly how it works. There are contestants who answer questions. They win their money in dollars, and then throughout the game, they have opportunities to buy prizes with that money. So it sort of incentivizes you to maybe give up your lead and kind of gauge how well you do with the questions going forward.
And the reason we call it Sale of the Century is because the dollars, which are effectively just points, are dramatically lower than what the prices of the items would be. So your question might be worth $5 or $10 or $15, but the prizes is, like I said, a refrigerator that's going to cost you $20. That's 20 points that comes off of your score, but then you get to keep that prize no matter what happens the rest of the day. And that way you don't, theoretically, if you have a greedy leader, you don't have runaways, because these people are buying the prizes and their score gets reduced so that they're back, competitive with the other players.
Did you have any?
I hope that made sense to people who've never seen it before, but I'm going to guess most of your listeners are familiar with Sale of the Century.
So this is one thing that I use to describe Sale of the Century to somebody who hasn't seen it, because like you mentioned a little while ago, it is a very fast-paced, competitive quiz game. And what I use to sort of illustrate that point, on Sale of the Century, if there was a new player that was overtaking the champion score, when the new player would answer a question right, the camera wouldn't get a shot of that player's reaction. It would get a shot of the champion's reaction, the reaction to the other player getting it right. And I feel like that's one of the ways that they sort of put an accent on the tension in games like that.
That's an interesting perspective. I had not noticed that, but you're right. That would be if that was deliberate and not just we're moving so quickly we're not always on the camera's not always on the one who buzzed in. That's a very interesting perspective. Yeah.
Did you have any particular strategy going into the game when you played back then? Okay.
Except just the innate understanding of the game. I mean, I didn't have a specific strategy, but again, unlike a lot of these people who were there just to try to get exposure on television, I mean, I remember talking to people in the group who truly did not know what the game was, did not know how to play. So how could you possibly have a strategy? They just wanted to be on a game show so that they could be on TV. So in that sense, I knew the game, so I knew innately what the strategy was. So I didn't go in, and that's the same for Jeopardy, frankly. I didn't go in with a specific plan of action. I'm going to play the game this way. I'm just going to play the game because I know how the game is played. Now, as it turned out, if we can get to the actual, I got fly back out 2 weeks later. I was either the first or second, very, very early on. There was a this is going to start sounding real familiar for people, spoiler, who are familiar with my Jeopardy experience. There was a very dominant champion who had won several days in a row by the time I took my seat. And when I started playing, I was unstoppable. I mean, I know I got the first 5 questions, bang, 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 bang. Nobody else even buzzed in. I got the first 5 all by myself, and then they stop and they have a prize, and I bought the prize. And then I got the next 3 or 4 in a row too before anybody else had even had a chance to play. I was beating everybody to the buzzer, and I'm thinking, this is great. But eventually the champion got her nerves back together, and I started missing a couple, and she started getting her, buzzing in, and it became a very, very competitive game. Now, the third player in our group, unfortunately, did not have a very good experience because the 2 of us were back and forth throughout the whole game. And as you know, the game comes down to a 60-second lightning round. I don't think they call it that. Speed round.
Right.
What they call it. And at the end of that speed round, I ended up tied with the champion. So I lost when the champion beat me to the tiebreaker question after regulation had ended in a tie. So that's how close I came to having won on Sale of the Century.
Wow.
Yeah.
Sometimes it comes down to that tiebreaker question. I talked to Mark DiCarlo last season, and his big win came as a result of one of those, just the first person to get it. And that's, when the buzzers are in view of everybody, it almost becomes a psychological game. And that's sort of what he did. He kind of twitched and made her flinch and hit her button when she didn't know the answer.
Now see, I don't think in those terms. That's a brilliant idea, and that's why Mark DiCarlo is one of the all-time champions of Sale of the Century, and I'm telling you my sad story.
Well, that's true. but the experience must have been incredible. I think of interacting with hosts like Jim Perry. Tell me what you remember about him. He's just one of my favorites.
Absolute first impression when you ask that question immediately springs to mind. He is tall.
Yes, I've heard that.
Yes, we don't, he's way over there, we're way over here. There's no interaction. As you know, game shows typically keep their hosts separate from the players.
Right.
So I don't meet him until the game is over. And everything is just happening so fast. I mean, the whole thing has been a blur. And I'm talking to this is long, we've stopped tape. We're all, oh, that was amazing. What a great game. And I'm talking to the champion and, about to sign papers and about to do this, about to do that. And he just like out of nowhere appears. And it's one of those, oh my goodness. And I'm looking up, and I don't know what his height is, but I'm an average height person. And I'm like, wow, that's a tall guy. That absolutely is my one, what was Jim Perry like thing. I don't recall that he had any interaction with us during the commercials. I don't recall any other contact with him outside of just shaking my hand and telling me how much fun that was. Like he's going to say to anybody, that was a good game. Thank you for playing and all that.
I might edit this out, but one of my favorite stories that I tell, relating to what you just mentioned, how there's that tradition at the end of a game show where the host will come over and, shake the hands of the players and say good game and kind of, congratulate the winner and talk about it while the credits roll. And I heard a story once from somebody who was on the Joker's Wild in like 73 or 74. And it was one of those episodes where Jack Barry at the end says, "Can you come back tomorrow?" And that's how they get to the next episode. Yeah. But he said his goodbyes and waved to the camera, and the credits roll. He walks over to the contestant, and he leans over the desk and says, "This is the part of the show where I'm supposed to pretend to talk to the contestant," and just moves his mouth without making any sound until they faded to black.
That's wonderful. I had never heard that story, but I've heard enough stories about Jack Barry to think that tracks.
Yeah, right.
You
It's
know?
not off brand. It's not off brand for Jack
It's not
Perry
that
at all.
tracks. Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's very funny.
What was Alec Baldwin like?
I didn't have a lot of interaction with him. I had a couple of interesting interactions. After I had won the game, I was standing center stage getting ready to do the super match, and they hadn't come back from commercial yet. So I have one person doing my makeup and another person standing next to me with a clipboard, and they're saying, okay, now this is the part of the show where you get to ask 3 celebrities what their answer is. You get to pick one or make one up. They're kind of just explaining the rules to me as a formality.
Rules that you know.
Oh, correct. Right.
Yes.
But I guess they legally have to talk.
Yeah.
Whatever. While all this is happening, Alec Baldwin comes close to me and leans into my face with his microphone until his nose is almost touching my cheek. And my wife is a trained comedian, and so I know to stay in the bit. So I just kind of stayed still and just let this happen. And then he backed up, lights came on, and we played the super match.
Weird. Yes.
Very weird.
He must have a reason that he does that, but that's
I like to think he was just having fun.
Sure.
You know,
Sure.
It was we actually we had to retake my my win when I won a match game because the first take I ran over and hugged him. And for whatever reason, they couldn't use that. So they said, you're going to win. I'll be excited and just run over to him. Don't hug him.
Oh.
I don't know.
That's very... Remind me who it was. I've forgotten.
Who's what?
Who did you match with?
Oh, at the end, the super match, it was Mario Cantone.
Okay.
Yeah, from Sex and the City.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you've had enough people on here, and it's the question everybody wants to know when you've been on a show. What's so-and-so really like? And you don't ever know because you don't really interact with the host.
Yeah, that's true. And that's by design. You know, there's standards and practices, and they, might give you the answers and so on and so forth. So tell me how you felt watching your performance on Sale of the Century. Did you get to see it as it aired? I know some contestants, they go years without seeing it because they didn't have a VCR or missed it or whatever.
No, there was a local station that aired the syndicated version. I remember vividly that we recorded what would have been the last week of that first syndicated season, a season that started in January. So it would have been an abbreviated first season. And I remember that because the handlers, the contestant coordinators, were telling us that, this was the shopping era where you would buy a prize with your winnings, or you would come back the next day, risk the winnings for a better prize.
Right.
And the contestant coordinators were explaining to us that because this was going to be the last week, and at the time they had not secured a renewal for a second season, that on the last show, whoever was the champ on the Friday show, you could say you're going to keep going, but if we get canceled, you're going to get whatever the prize is. So that right. I just remember that them explaining that to us, and that helps me remember that it was the last week of the first season. As it turned out, they did have a second season, and I've forgotten what the original question was, whether I saw it or not. Yes, I did see it, watched it with some friends, and I was genuinely unhappy. By and large, I knew I had done really, really well, and it hadn't worked out, and that was disappointing. I'm not ashamed to say that, especially since we're going to get to Jeopardy soon. But it was not necessarily, certainly all my friends, back in the 80s, that's still kind of a novelty to see somebody that on television. So I was getting phone calls, and I was getting questions, and I was getting noticed, and it was that part of it was a lot of fun. But the fact that I'd worked so hard to finally be on this format of show that I've so loved all my life, only to have come so close and missed out, was ultimately kind of disappointing. Now, I'm told I've never watched it in the years that have followed, but I'm told that in this era where everything is viewable, that on Pluto or something, my episodes of my episode of Sale of the Century is watchable by people today. That it's just available somewhere.
I think
that's
so.
remarkable.
I think it aired on Buzzer sometime within the last couple months. I remember somebody saying Matt Ottinger's Sale of the Century episodes are coming up.
And that's just, I mean, at the time that you're doing that, it's going to be on the local station one time, and that's going to be the end of it. The idea that survives is just kind of remarkable to me. But then again, I'm fascinated by the old shows, and so much of that has survived, and so much of that we do watch today. So maybe it's not so weird.
That's an interesting point. I want to focus on this for a minute because in our world here, in our little fandom, one of the most exciting things to happen is when an episode of a previously thought lost show surfaces, and we're able to see it again for the first time in however many years. And it's happened with the Money Maze within the last year or so. It's happened with Password, so many others that where new media is sort of rising.
Well, and as we're talking, it was about a week ago where somebody shared some audio recordings that he had made of basically a day's worth of game shows back in 1974, which is my sweet spot. And even though it's just the sound, it's a chance to relive things like Celebrity Sweepstakes and Winning Streak and Jackpot, and some of these shows that didn't necessarily get preserved. Weirdly, and it's a whole big thing about how many of these shows did get preserved for one reason or another, but many of them didn't. So while practically every What's My Line and practically every I've Got a Secret is available for viewing, even though they were aired in the 1950s, there's stuff from the 70s that it's just like gold when you discover an episode that had previously not been known to exist.
Yeah, that's so true. And especially, again, for a genre of TV that was for so long thought to be disposable. Like, why would you want to see a game again once it's been played and you already know who wins? Like, it was before the replay value was ever realized, which is, it's amazing that there was a time where that was true.
Yeah.
I had a point to this and I completely forgot, but I love talking about.
But it's always fun.
That's right. I guess I love talking about like that aspect of it because I have greatly benefited from knowing how to use the internet from a young age, and being able to follow websites like yours back in the day. The game show home game page and the game show forum and all these places where there are like-minded people, because I certainly didn't have any in real life. I knew no other game show fans in person.
No. And again, I'm a generation older than you, and when I first discovered the internet, this before the internet was the internet, and we had the Usenet discussion groups, alt TV game shows. This would have been early 90s, and to discover that there were other people who were fans of game shows, like avid fans of game shows, like a bigger fan of game shows than I am. That just blew my mind. And some of those people that I met in that early period, oh gosh, that's been 30 years now, are some of my best friends today. So yeah, it's this is what happens, people. Your faithful listening audience. This is what happens when you get a couple of game show nerds talking to each other.
That's exactly it. Yes.
This is what you're just, you have Shelley Herman. She's telling delightful stories about her time as a page and working with Chuck Barris and all these other things. You and me, we're just nerding out.
We're on the computer talking about being on the computer.
Yes. You get Bob Harris on here. He's talking about how he's saving the world.
That's right.
We're all excited because the audio of an episode of Winning Streak exists.
I'm going to check right now. That's the only one that I downloaded because I was so excited to listen to it, because that's such a lost show. I had a video production professor in college whose first job in television was at 30 Rock in the 70s, and he was a production assistant. He was assigned to Winning Streak.
Oh,
and he told me that one of his duties was on the way into the taping and out of the taping, he would walk with Bill Cullen arm in arm so that the audience wouldn't notice his limp.
how very cool.
Isn't that fascinating?
What a neat thing that they did that. What a neat thing that he has that story to tell.
Yeah,
that's fantastic. I don't think you ever shared that with me. I love that.
Had I not? I
love
certainly
that.
meant to. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was able, he was fascinated that I even knew what winning streak was. It absolutely blew his mind. And, and I found this out because I stayed after the class and I said, tell me everything you remember about working with Bill Cullen. And he said that was the one he was very nice and smelled like cigarettes, which that's not even a negative to me because that reminds me of my dad personally. But
I've got one for you.
Oh, please.
Is there a time limit here? Because we're just going way afield.
No. There is no time limit.
That's the beauty of it. Let me tell you a story. You talk about how he's amazed that you even knew what winning streak was. I worked for the public broadcasting station locally. I did our show Quizbusters here. And one day we're going to have a visit from Carol Spinney. Do you know who Carol Spinney is?
Sesame Street, Big Bird.
Sesame Street guy. He was Big Bird. He was Oscar the Grouch.
Right.
So a friend of mine picks Carol Spinney and his wife up from the airport, and they're making small talk on the way in. And somehow the conversation goes to the fact that Carol Spinney's wife was on a game show in the 70s. And my friend obviously knows me, and she was asking out of curiosity what the show was, and Carol Spinney's wife said, "Oh, you wouldn't know it. It's a real obscure show with Bill Cullen." and my friend says, "We have someone you're going to want to meet."
That's right.
Now, in this case, it turned out to be 3 on a Match.
Oh, wonderful.
She had been on 3 on a Match. So at this event, I'm in one studio, theoretically talking to people who come in and visit about Quizbusters. Carol Spinney is in a different studio with Oscar on his arm, being Oscar and talking to people and I guess signing autographs with his other hand. I don't know. I wasn't there. I was in the other studio. But Mrs. Spinney hung out with me, and in between, we just talked about her 3 on a Match experience. And of course, like anybody, she wants to know if her episode exists. And I told her that no, it would be very unlikely.
Yeah.
But when we finished, I got their address and sent her whatever VHS tapes. That's how long ago it was. Whatever VHS tapes we had, there's 5 or 6 episodes out there. So I sent them, and she was able to watch the show again in a way that she had never been able to watch, even if it wasn't her show. Starting that Christmas, I was on Big Bird's Christmas card list. Carol Spinney was an artist. He's passed away now. Carol Spinney was an artist who would draw these elaborate, colorful Christmas designs that would always include him, her, Big Bird, and Oscar, and a lot of other stuff. And he would, whatever they would duplicate tons of these in color, but fold them up and send them out as Christmas cards. And I've got like 10 of these. And it's one of my favorite things that I own because of this ridiculous story about Mrs. Bird. She didn't like to be called Little Bird. She liked to be called Mrs. Bird.
Mrs. Bird.
Mrs. Bird, and her appearance on 3 on a Match, and that she met somebody who knew what that show was.
Wow. How incredible is that?
I haven't thought about that story in a really long time, but when you said he was surprised I even knew what winning streak was, I said, yes.
Right. Yeah, and it was the same thing. It was the first day of class, and he was introducing himself, and he said, my first job in television was at 30 Rock in New York City, and I raised my hand. I said, could you tell me what you did there? And he said, it was some obscure game show. You won't remember it. I'm not even going to bother saying it. And I said, I need you to try me.
You do not know who you were talking to.
That's right. That's right. And he said, it's called Winning Streak. I said, with Bill Cullen. He went, oh my God, yes. That's always fun. It's always fun to meet somebody who appreciates that area of knowledge, which again is why it was so great to come across like-minded people on the internet.
I had promised one more story about my first trip to California and looking in the want ads for opportunities.
Oh, yes, you did. Please tell me.
And of course, many of them were larger ads. If they were the network shows, they would have bigger ads. Smaller shows would have smaller ads. There was a small ad. Be aware, I know nothing about this. This is before any awareness. So there's a small ad from Comedy Central that they're about to start a comedy game show that's going to be hosted by Ben Stein. And I looked at that ad and I thought to myself, because I knew who Ben Stein was, that's got to be the stupidest thing in the world. There's no way I'm going to be interested in doing that. And for that reason, I did not get a chance to audition to be on Win Ben Stein's Money.
Oh, what a wonderful show.
I didn't learn. Of course, who knew?
Oh, of course.
Literally, all I had to work with was this ad that said Comedy Central and a show with Ben Stein. And I thought, well, that's going to be dumb.
Yeah.
And it was this fantastic show. So that's like a missed opportunity. If I had pursued that, I might have ended up on Win Ben Stein's Money instead.
Right. And, speaking of the game show online community, I think that so many of us are so guilty of that when we hear that an old show is going to be rebooted. They're going to do a new version of this. They're going to do a primetime version of that. We judge it before we see it because we automatically assume, they're not going to get it. They're not going to understand what made the original one so special.
But in this case, I had a very narrow interest in what I wanted to do, and that would have been perfect. But I had no way of knowing because the show had not been on yet.
Right.
As it turns out, it would have been a fantastic show to be on, but I had no clue.
So you appeared on Sale of the Century, and in doing so, it was an experience where you ran into a champion who had won several games and was on a sort of insurmountable winning streak.
Yep.
And then it never happened again.
It'll never happen again. That's right. Fast forward. Let Uncle Matt tell you a story.
Tell me what year Jeopardy occurred. What year was that?
Well, at this point now, I'm older now, and I have a little bit of disposable income, and I'm visiting these friends that I made on the Usenet News Group in California, including a dear friend, David Hammett, and Aaron Solomon, who has become a wildly successful producer in this industry, and people like that. And I would go every year and visit with them. Well, back then, and we're talking, this is 2003, you still auditioned for Jeopardy by going to a hotel where they were set up. I guess sometimes they would do it in their studios, but generally you would go to a place where they were holding Jeopardy auditions.
Okay, right,
and
before
you would
the
take
online
the written test. What's that?
I said before the online test.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
This is old days. So you had to be out there. They would very rarely travel. You would go out there and you would audition, take the written test, do the mock test, do the whole thing. And one visit out there, I decided I would go for it. So again, this is sometime in 2003, and it went very well. I passed the written test. I played the fake game well. I remember. When you talk about strategies, one of the things I was always careful to do is show a lot more enthusiasm for being there and playing the game than whether I won or lost. I wanted them to see that I was going to have a good time. I didn't want to show off that I could beat everybody else in this hotel room. I wanted to show them that I wanted to be on this show. And for whatever reason, it worked because they told me I was in the pool and that I would get a call within the next, 9 months or so. And if I didn't get a call, then I'm out of the pool and you have to start the process over again. So whatever. And it got kind of out of my head. I knew I had done it. You don't wait by the phone. You get on with your life. And in March, I was called. They wanted me. And I had been there in maybe the fall of 2004. So it had been a while. And in March, I get the call. We'd love to have you. Going to play. It's going to be great. You're going to have a good time. And so I made my arrangements. Luckily, I have my friend David I usually stay with when I'm out there. So I didn't have a hotel room to worry about. And went out there and then drove to Culver City that morning and met the gang. Now, so here's a bit of a story. Only about a year before that experience, had they changed the rules about returning champions. For the longest time in the syndicated version, just as in the original daytime version, a champion could come back for 5 shows, and then the champion would retire undefeated. You would be an undefeated champion, and that was a mark of distinction. And then every so often, for Jeopardy, it became an annual thing. There would be a tournament of champions, which of course they still do, and those undefeated champions would play against each other in this special event. So in the wake of Millionaire and in the wake of there being larger jackpots, somebody came up with the idea on Jeopardy. You know what would be good is if we didn't retire a champion. We just kept the champion going, and the champion could win as many times until they eventually got beat. You know, there's enough fluky luck in Jeopardy. You get a final Jeopardy that you don't know, or you miss a daily double. Things can happen. Nobody's going to completely dominate the game, and maybe somebody will win $1 million or so.
Yeah.
Great idea. It was game changing for the show. I mean, people who watch today, it's been so long ago, they might not even be aware that there was a time where people would play 5 shows and you're out. So anyway,
right.
This had happened about a year ago. And over the course of watching the show on television, we have seen a 6-game champion. We had seen a 7, maybe an 8-game champion. And then that was, wow, that's pretty impressive that you get to keep going and you get to make more money. So we get to the studio, and all of us new people are gathered together in the same spot. And then we come into the waiting room, and we're introduced to Ken Jennings. And we're told for the first time that he has won 14 games. And you could hear the air go out of the room. You could just hear, everybody in the room was, oh my gosh, we're going to have to play somebody who's won 14 times. Nobody's ever going to win 14 times.
And of course, you're new to this because it hasn't been televised yet.
Right. And these have not aired yet. Exactly. Right. These haven't aired yet. And we're just astonished by the number 14.
Yeah.
It hasn't even begun. So Ken Jennings is the 14-day champion when we start our little thing. Now, I know that I'm good at this. I know that I'm quick at doing the buzzer because I had done so well on Sale of the Century all those years ago. And I've done my own local academic quiz program. So I kind of have been exposed to a lot of this material. I think I'm going to do pretty well. But still, when you're told you're going up against a guy who's already won 14 times, that can be a little jarring.
Sure.
So, okay, so I'll sit in the audience for a few games. I'll get an idea of what he's like, and then I'll play him. Nope. I'm called up to play the Monday show. I am me and another player are called up to play right away. So except for a little bit of practice that you get right before the tapings actually begin, thrown to the lions, just right into it. And here we go. And just like on Sale of the Century, I start off really, really hot. I wasn't answering all the questions because, good God, it's Ken Jennings.
Sure.
But I was getting in before him. I was beating him to the buzzer. And there was a category, I think it was nonfiction books, where I ran the category. I got all the questions right. And there was a category about musicals, which is my sweet spot. So I did really well in that category. And in the Jeopardy round, I did really, really well. And I started to feel pretty good that this was something that could happen. At the end of the Jeopardy round, and I'm sure this is available. I'm sure somebody has posted this on YouTube or whatever, again, Pluto or whatever. I'm sure it's viewable.
Sure.
At the end of the Jeopardy round, I was ahead. For 15 minutes, I was beating Ken Jennings.
That's right. And I remember it because when I saw you on the show, for me, that was the first time I had ever seen a contestant on a game show that I somehow knew. I said, I know that name, you know, because I had loved your game show home game site.
And I got to say in the interview what a big fan of Bill Cullen I was.
Right. Which I love hearing his name as well. Sure.
That was a nice little bonus. So for 15 minutes, I was beating Ken Jennings. Now, as you and your listeners may know, Jeopardy is a 30-minute show. So,
right.
So there's a second half to play. Sure. And I discovered a couple things. Primarily, everybody makes a big deal about how fast Ken is on the buzzer. I am confident in saying I was faster than Ken on the buzzer. And if you watch the Jeopardy round, you see that happening. That is my proof that I was faster than Ken Jennings on the buzzer.
What's your secret? Describe your technique to me.
They say you have to wait for the light to buzz in. You anticipate the light.
The light around the board that indicates that
right, there's a thing that the audience at home can't see, a light that comes on, and your buzzer doesn't work until that light comes on. But if you wait for that light to be on and then hit your buzzer, it's too late. You have to anticipate when you think the light is going to be on. And if you get the rhythm right, you're in really good shape. So anyway, I want to make sure that I'm not pretending that I'm bragging about any of this.
Sure.
I was faster than Ken on the buzzer. When we get to Double Jeopardy, the truth comes out. He just knows a shit ton more than I do.
Right. The ancient Jeopardy strategy.
That's the thing. You know, it's one thing to be fast, and good for me, I was faster than Ken Jennings, but you still have to know the stuff.
Sure.
And when it got into the questions being, you know, more challenging, he just knew things that I just didn't know. And in the Double Jeopardy round, you start seeing that relatively slim lead that I had. You see that start to trickle away, and I was very lucky that I was able to play, that I was competitive with him in Final Jeopardy. He did not make my game a runaway as he did with so many of his games, because
it was rather close.
It was close enough. There's Final Jeopardy wagering I'm very, very good at, and there's something about being, if you're this close, then you don't have to wager anything because he's going to wager enough that he'll go below you. But if you're not that close, then it doesn't really matter because you're going to have to get it right anyway, so you might as well wager all your money. There's a whole thing to it that we don't need to get into.
Sure.
But I wasn't so close that I could just sit on my money and hope he missed. I had to get it right, and also he had to get it wrong was the only combination that would have worked in Final Jeopardy. And the opposite happened, as it turns out. So it wouldn't have mattered anyway. He got Final Jeopardy. I didn't get Final Jeopardy. And that was the end of that.
And again, just what an experience. Would you describe yourself? All right. So I'll ask it this way. Was there a point during your game where you maybe felt that initial intimidation fall away? Did that happen relatively early on, or was there like a definitive moment?
No, I would say if you watch the first segment of the Jeopardy round before we get to the interviews,
right,
I am clearly dominating. I am just all over it. I don't know if that was. I think I had swept the category in that segment. I know that he had missed a question. He had beaten me to the buzzer in a Broadway question. I'm sorry, clue. Did not give the correct response. I'm going to say this and use the right terms eventually. Did not give the correct response. I rebounded and gave the correct response. The very next clue was a daily double, and I doubled all my money. So at the end of that break, it's just ridiculous how far ahead I am. Now I'm not
right. You've asserted dominance.
Yes. Now I know perfectly well that that's just a quarter of the game, but you talk about the intimidation. I said, oh no, I am more than competitive at this point. This is something I am good at and something I am competitive at playing, even against somebody who won. And I can't repeat this enough. 14 games.
Right. Unheard of at that point. I don't think anyone had won more than 7 or 8 before.
No, 7 or 8 had been the most.
Right.
So, so there was that feeling that, oh, this could happen after all. And in the end it didn't. And that was, again, it wasn't like it was a tiebreaker like it was for Sale of the Century, but again, I'm good at this and I get my shot. And I end up having to play the guy who eventually became, legally proven in tournament action to be the greatest player of all time. Therefore, I can say with some confidence that I can claim to be the second best Jeopardy player of all time, and no one can prove me wrong.
That's absolutely, and now that is immortalized in the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York.
I feel like I have to include the laughter when I say this, just in case anybody thinks I'm possibly serious about this.
Sure.
One of the fun things about being a part of this world, not just the game show fandom, but the trivia fandom. And for years we were having, and I guess they still have versions of it, the Tacona, the trivia competitions in Las Vegas.
Right.
I have befriended some of the elite trivia people. And like I like to tell my friends here, when I go to Las Vegas to play these trivia games with these trivia people, I am barely average. I know where I stand in the pecking order of trivia. I am very, very good, but I know people who are great. And I had to play one of the great ones, and I have played other great ones and usually lost in other kinds of competitions. So I know where my place is, but it still stung a lot to know that I'm good and not have the opportunity to have proven that. Now, certainly anymore, and this was, again, almost 20 years ago now, when you tell that story, oh yeah, the guy who's hosting now, well, that, he had the big long run, and I was one of the people who played against him. And inevitably, well, how did you do? Well, I lost. What do you think I did? But it's, and people say, well, as long as, if you're going to lose, at least you lost to Ken. And that's, that's valid. That's not the way my brain works. My brain works, I shouldn't have had to play Ken. It's completely illogical, but that's where my brain is. It's been very, very difficult, especially, again, as Ken has stayed in the spotlight. Ken never really went away, and now he's back in an almost unfathomable way. I mean, who would have thought, even after being this great champion, that he would end up hosting the show? I mean, good for him. I mean, that's fantastic. But who would have thought that?
I remember back in the day when the second place prize was a tennis racket.
Yes, exactly.
Now you can host the damn thing.
I got to say, the worst thing in my life ever is that I've come in second on a game show twice. That's not a bad life.
That's very true. And it's absolutely. And it's something that I talk about all the time with the various guests that I've had on the show. Getting on the show is a prize, if not the prize. I mean, talk about the odds that you beat to get to where you are, to be one of those 3 people on set playing Jeopardy, or even Sale of the Century.
And in my head right now, you are an adult in a Peanuts cartoon. You're just going, meh, 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 meh.
Right.
My brain has never been able to process beyond, it should have gone differently. And I don't know why that is. It's not like it's crippling. I make jokes about it. But by golly, I wanted a chance to win. And I came close against Ken Jennings. Who knows what could have happened against average competition?
Matt, what qualities, traits, or skills should be in the possession of a good Quiz Bowl host?
Well, we've been toying, we mentioning it on the edges. I guess I should explain a little bit for people who don't know, and I don't expect anybody to know except people who know me, that for 29 years here in the mid-Michigan area, I hosted one of these academic quiz competitions. People know them all over the country. They're different cities will have different types of these things, but it's academic or academic challenge or university challenge across the pond. All these games where usually high school at the local level, but sometimes colleges, teams play against each other representing the different schools in a more academic kind of competition. Questions about literature and science and geography and history and so on. I got the very good opportunity to do that for 29 years, starting in like 89. So that has been, I talk about the negatives of my game show experiences. That overwhelmingly has been a positive. I have an Emmy Award. Okay, it's a local Emmy Award,
but that's an Emmy nonetheless.
But it looks just like the ones that Julie Louis-Dreyfus waves around.
Sure, of course. I don't think I knew that, Matt.
Yes, I. It's actually not for hosting. It's because I was always listed as one of the two producers.
Sure,
there was my producer, and then I did a lot of stuff for the show that got me a producer credit. So we were the two producers. So when I was nominated locally, and I say locally, it's like the Michigan region for hosting many times, but I never won one for hosting. That would have been fun. But one time we did win an award for the show itself. And because my producer was nice enough to include both names, I have an Emmy Award.
What a wonderful achievement.
In terms of what makes a good host, I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily limited to a good academic show quiz host, but obviously for something like that, when you're reading constantly, you've got to be able to, I know it's the skill set of a precocious 7-year-old. You have to be able to read aloud. That is not something everybody can do. I'm lucky that I've been blessed with a decent voice. I never trained vocally. It's just part of who I am. So that's been fortunate. But most of all, it's the enthusiasm. And this is true for a host, and it's also true for a contestant. It's more true for a contestant. And I mentioned it before. That they'll be able to tell whether you can do the job well or not. What you have to prove is that you want to be there. You are enthusiastic about that experience. For me, and honestly, my experience with Jeopardy and Ken helped me, because now I'm on the other side of that. I am the local Alex Trebek, and these kids who aren't going to get a chance to be on a national game show for the most part, this is their Jeopardy. This is their moment where they're on television. And 4 of these kids are going to win the game, and 4 of these kids are going to lose the game. And I have to show empathy and enthusiasm at the same time. But especially after the show stops and we're not recording anymore, I've got to make sure that the ones that lost are still feeling okay. And I've had tears. I mean, not regularly. Most everybody just, we have a good time and it's fun and you win, you lose and whatever. But I've had contestants in tears afterwards because they didn't win their game.
Yeah,
I
can
have
imagine.
a story to tell. I can tell them, you may not know this, but I was on Jeopardy. And then I don't tell the story the way I told it to you in 20 minutes of whatever, but I tell them that, I know what this feels like. I know how it hurts when you've looked forward to doing this and it didn't go the way you wanted. And, getting blown out is one thing. Losing a close game or losing a game you think you might have been able to win, that hurts more. And I know that. And I can share with those kids my experience. And that's helped a lot. So the empathy and the enthusiasm for what it is you're doing really has to shine through. I think some comedians and actors, I mean, I love watching certain actors and comedians hosting game shows, and others, it's just so painfully obvious that they're just there because it's a big paycheck and they're not really into what it is they're doing.
Yeah,
and I think that comes through on the air.
Oh, it sure does. Yeah, and audiences are very perceptive. that is a very interesting dynamic that you touch on. The idea that, because I think that a good game show host should be somebody that's relatable to the contestant in a human sort of way. Because I think that that's how you get those warm and funny interactions that kind of make game shows, sing. But there is value, I think, in having a quiz show hosted by somebody who had the experience of losing on a quiz show and therefore can relate to the potential embarrassment and can serve as proof that there is life after that.
In a broader sense, and yes, that's the point that I was making, and let me expand that a little bit. I did not bring this show to WKAR, our station in our PBS station in the Mid-Michigan area. They decided they wanted to do a show, and they auditioned hosts. So I auditioned for the job up against local, DJs. I think there was a newscaster or two that threw their hat into the ring. There were people at the station who auditioned.
Right.
My edge was that I knew game shows. And by this point, locally, I'm known for being a game show guy. So I might not have given the best performance in the audition, but I had that secret weapon that I was going to be able to contribute content-wise. I'm not going to claim that I wrote all the questions, but I'll tell you I wrote some of the questions, and I edited practically every question. That was really my responsibility on the producerial side, is I was kind of the content guy. The producers would be, and I had such great relationships with my producers over the years, would be responsible for scheduling the team, scheduling the studio, scheduling all the stuff. So much paperwork and planning and organizational stuff that they did, but they left it to me to have the packets ready to play the game. We got the material from a variety of different sources, but I was part of that in a way that just somebody who was a good on-air performer wouldn't necessarily have been able to contribute. So I think just the fact that I was a game show fan and the fact that I've had those losing experiences both helped, at least in my specific situation, both helped make that happen.
Matt, how do you prepare for a game show hosting audition? What do you remember about that process?
I remember so very little because it was such a long time. Now it's been, this would have been 88 that I would have auditioned. So,
sure.
So way more than 30 years ago now.
Well, even in the case of thinking about being a game show host, who did you want to emulate? What would have been your go-to in terms of whose style you wanted to emulate?
Everybody who is listening to your podcast right now and who knows me is expecting one answer, and I'm going to give a different answer because I've always adored Bill Cullen, and everybody knows that. And if you go to billcullen.net, there's our plug, Adam. Adam Neediff and I put the Bill Cullen, the definitive Bill Cullen website up there, just as Adam has written the definitive Bill Cullen biography.
Two wonderful resources, by the way, and thank you for all of that work.
The Bill Cullen site is mostly Adam's work as well, but we are theoretically a team. So Adam Neediff and I do billcullen.net, and Adam has written a book, and a second version of that book is going to be coming out hopefully later this year.
Yep.
But no, and we talked about him earlier. I always loved the way that Jim Perry ran Sale of the Century. I liked the way he interacted with the contestants. I liked where he found the moments for humor, and I liked where he didn't mess around. When he's asking the questions one right after the other, bang, 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 we're not going to stop and make jokes after every question. But on the beats, he knows where, if you want to throw a little aside in here, that's a good time to do it. But he knew, I could see him working. I could see what the rhythms were that he saw. And I tried to carry that over. If you were to watch an episode of Quizbusters, you will note that it ends with brazenly stolen the 60-second speed round from Sale of the Century. There's just no, I mean, we're off the air now. Nobody's going to sue us. And
Sure.
Reg Grundy certainly isn't going to sue us for stealing game shows if anybody knows the history of his productions.
Right.
But the last 60 seconds of Quizbusters is the last 60 seconds of Sale of the Century. No question about it. And that was deliberate. That was something, again, as the station is developing the show, I sort of showed them, this is a really cool thing, and it's a great way to end the show. And they agreed, and we did it. And we did it for, like I said, for 29 years. And it's exciting even when the game is out of reach. And in academic quiz competitions, the games are usually out of reach. It's very rare in an academic quiz format that you get a close game. There's usually a dominant player or two on a dominant team or two, and games are lopsided. So we wanted something that would be fun even when you knew that the game was over.
Sure.
And that's what the speed round turned out to be. We called it the lightning round, which is why I get confused.
Right. And what's more exciting than a come from behind victory in the speed round?
When it happens, it's great.
Oh,
it
sure.
did not happen that much in our situation. But yeah, the ones that did were our best shows because it was so exciting. But then again, then you've got the kids that thought they were going to win, and then they didn't win, so I got to go have the talk with them. So it's a whole thing.
Matt, it is 8:30, and I'm realizing that there are so many things to talk with you about. And with your permission, I might make this a two-parter. Could we do that?
I would be delighted. I think mostly you're doing this because I've just blathered on with my goofy stories, but sure, I'd
No,
love
not
to.
at all. No. I just like, there's so much else I want to ask you, and there's so many different kind of roads we can go down here. And I'm just realizing that it's gonna take, I think it might take a second one. And I think that it would be a lot of fun, especially for the people we know who listen to it. I think that they would, I think they love it.
I think there's a very narrow group of people that we're doing this show for. And they all know who they are.
Absolutely.
And they're listening right now and saying, yep, I'm one of them.
That's exactly.
Yes. I still haven't told you about the game show I wasn't on.
Right. Yeah, we didn't even get to that. Yeah,
So
we have so much more to do. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I want to end this here, and we'll set up something. I'm getting my wisdom teeth out Thursday, so I'll be down for a couple days. I know. Oh, I can't wait though. Long awaited.
Yeah, it's one of those things. When you've done it and you're over it, it's fantastic. But
right.
Until then,
Right. Exactly. So I'm doing that, and then either for next week or the week after, we'll set something else up.
I'd love that, Christian. Thank you.
Yeah.
You're a lot of fun to chat with this about, as I knew you would be. So I'm having a grand time. I'd love to do it again.
Oh, thank you so much. You as well. I'm having a wonderful time.
Terrific.
Thank you. This was great. I'll talk soon, Matt. All right.
All right.
Thank you, my friend. Bye-bye. Tell Us About Yourself. Conversations with Game Show Contestants is hosted, produced, and edited by me, Christian Carrion, from my studio in beautiful downtown Lancaster City, Pennsylvania. Co-executive producer Cory Anotado. Researcher Chuck Donegan. This has been a production of BuzzerBlog, the most popular game show website in the world, in partnership with the National Archives of Game Show History at the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York. For more information, visit museumofplay.org. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Christian Carrion. Good night. Tell Us About Yourself is sponsored by bonusround.ca, streaming Canada's classic game shows on demand. Dive into the golden age of television with thousands of episodes of Canadian series that defined an era from anywhere in the world, all for just $1.99 a month. From iconic shows like Let's Make a Deal and Definition to cult classics like Bumper Stumpers and The Mad Dash, bonusround.ca brings you timeless entertainment that's fun, enlightening, and affordable. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, relive the magic of Canadian television history. Subscribe now at bonusround.ca for $1.99 and turn every night into Game Show Night. By Game Show Forensics. Join host Robert McKee and his crack team of forensic game show scientists as they take you on the deepest dives imaginable in a quest to analyze the most detailed minutia of game shows nobody else dares to, or cares to, investigate. Nothing is too whimsical for examination, no semantics too absurd for the research extremists at GameShowForensics.com. Parental discretion is advised. And by The Inn at Leola Village. Nestled in the heart of picturesque Pennsylvania, the Inn at Leola Village is a sanctuary of luxury and relaxation. Indulge in the timeless beauty of their historic suites, each meticulously designed to transport you to a bygone era of elegance and grace. Experience the culinary delights of their award-winning Italian restaurant, where every dish is a masterpiece crafted from the finest local ingredients. From romantic getaways to corporate retreats, the Inn at Leola Village offers a haven for every occasion. Unwind at the spa, stroll through the lush gardens, and let the stress of everyday life melt away. Make your reservation today at theinnatleolavillage.com or call the front desk at area code 717-656-7002. The Inn at Leola Village, an oasis of luxury.